Well, analysts continue to speculate on the implications of an international reserve currency planned by Russia and China amid fears that the US might be facing a recession. Now, the announcement of a reserve currency was made by Russian President Vladimir Putin during the BRICS Summit in June. Meanwhile, former US President Donald Trump warns of a depression if the US economy continues on the slow growth path. Associate Professor of African Politics at Unisa, Professor Everisto Benyera, as well as Redge Nkosi, who is the Executive Director and the Head of Research on Macroeconomics, Money and Banking at Firstsource Money, join us for a discussion. Great to have both of you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Leanne. Thanks for having us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Yeah, Reg, let me begin with you. I mean, we speak about a reserve currency as if everybody knows what a reserve currency actually is. So perhaps let's start with the basics here. What exactly is a reserve currency, and why should societies bother with what actually happens in the space when they have this kind of thing?
Yeah, a reserve currency is that dominant currency in which transactions, economic transactions, are mostly used in a region, in a continent, globally. So in this case, we have the US dollar as the preeminent reserve currency. This does not necessarily mean the US dollar itself is the reserve currency. The euro is to some extent, and Japanese yen, but preeminently the US dollar is that currency which international economic transactions are conducted in. So it becomes a vital cog in international economic governance. Hence, such an important issue as currency reserves being now suggested by the BRICS.
Okay, so we look at that and the dollar is the dominant reserve currency. I mean, in a nutshell, that's pretty much so what it is. But we've got Russia saying, hang on a second, this should not be the case. We should look at our own reserve currency as discussed at BRICS. Is that in basics what the Russian president is suggesting?
Absolutely. That's exactly what the president is suggesting, is because the US is abusing that dominance it has for its currency. So we have what they call the exorbitant privilege that the US has for its currency, being the one that's being used globally. So the US is using that as a tool, as a weapon to whip all those that do not comply with whatever it wants them to comply with.
And when we look at the state of the US at the moment, and we talk about the US economy, and perhaps, Prof, you want to come in and also weigh in on this. With having the US as a reserve currency and, you know, the threats and the talk of a recession and then a depression, and having the US currency as that reserve, what implications are there? Let's talk about that now.
Leanne and the viewers, good morning, and thanks, Reg, for laying that foundation. Let me politicize a bit or put it in football terms as it were. A reserve currency underwrites state sovereignty. So there is usually a link between failed states and a currency. You tend to find states that are failed having no currency at all. So this is why there is so much talk, so much attention, and so much hype about this reserve currency, because there is a direct link between state sovereignty and a currency. In this case, the sovereignty of the global south, underwritten by the BRICS countries. Secondly, Leanne, we are witnessing a new international financial order in the making. Whether we like it or not, there is a new financial order that is being developed as an alternative to the dollar-euro dominated international financial order, mainly because of what Reggie said, which is the abuse of the current system by the United States and its allies. Thirdly, allow me to observe that you cannot separate money from war. The two are interlinked, because the most profitable business in the world is a war. There is no war in history that has made a loss. This is why Cicero said, money is the soul of the war. So if all wars are profitable, then we can trace the rise of not only reserve currencies, but currencies themselves to war. When the Massachusetts Bay Colony printed the first banknotes in the United States way back in 1690, it was to fund its military operations. Again, in 1914, when the First World War, the so-called First World War ended, that is when we saw the rise of the United States dollar as the global reserve currency, courtesy of the meeting that occurred at the Bretton Woods institutions. So we see a direct link between war and currencies. So what are the implications for the United States if I now go back to your question? Firstly, there is going to be inflation at home. Inflation is going to visit the United States of America. Secondly, the United States is now going to fight in many fronts, because remember, there is already a challenge that is coming from digital currencies such as blockchain technologies as an alternative to the US dollar hegemony. So now it is going to be fighting on two fronts. Thirdly, the de-dollarization, this process that is happening, will expose the reality that the gold that is presumed to be in Fort Knox is not there. And finally, the US veto at the IMF and the World Bank will become obsolete.
All right. So it's so interesting, because I want to I think we need to take a little bit of a history lesson here as well to find out how, in fact, the US dollar became this reserve currency. Because, I mean, if we go back, like you say, war, it brings about these things. But I mean, if we go back to 1971, the world left the gold standard, and that was basically where it was. Gold was that reserve currency. And the US announced that they're no longer going to be converting dollars to gold. So the question is, why was the gold standard abandoned? And how did the US dollar become this almighty reserve currency? Who determined that? And at the same time, how do we determine that the US currency will no longer be the reserve currency? Because it has been for a long time. But how do we stop that from happening?
Is that for me?
Go for it, Redge. Jump in. Yes. Apologies. You go for it.
Thank you very much. Just a bit of correction there. What happened in 1971 was that the Bretton Woods system got abolished. The Bretton Woods system was such that the dollar itself was pegged to the gold, and the rest of the currencies were therefore fixed or pegged to the US dollar. And the US dollar began to be a currency of reserve as early as 1940s. Actually, the Bretton Woods institutions, when they were being formed around 1940s, 1945, that's when the UK British pound lost its reserve currency status towards the US. And therefore, the US emerged as one such currency because of the economy was quite strong, and it was sponsoring much of the development in the EU as we speak now. So yes, it emerged therefore as such a currency. And in 1971, the demand for gold by France from the US became clear that the Fort Knox, as my colleague puts it, had no gold at all that would be given to each country that would demand it. Therefore, the President Nixon, abandoned the gold standard backing, and all currencies became fiat.
Yeah.
Now, going forward, therefore, given the dominance, therefore, of this dollar status, and countries are emerging, in fact, it started around 2009, when President Dmitry Medvedev of the Russian Federation suggested that since the crisis of 2007-2008, the US was becoming the very unreliable partner in global affairs. Therefore, there's need for us to begin to explore ways in which we could have a new financial order. It began then.
Yeah.
And then today, BRICS is moving pretty fast to ensure that it has a reserve currency which is dependable, which is not subject to the whims of one country, and therefore, here the BRICS are coming up with this new system.
Okay, so let's kind of dumb it down again even more. I want to know who actually decides on something like this, because so you've got the US. This is the reserve currency. I mean, when we see it, I mean, Prof, you spoke about a failed state, and you know the dollar automatically comes in. I mean, we look at something like our neighboring country, Zimbabwe. I mean, this is what happens. This comes in, but who makes the decision that the dollar won't be that currency anymore because there are so many complexities in geopolitics. I mean, at the moment, when we look at war with the Europe and the Ukraine, I mean, all of these things that are going on there in Russia, we now see this visit that's taking place, we see Nancy Pelosi from US moving and going and visiting Taiwan, and there are massive tensions now between the US and China. So there's definitely a big global shift taking place. So who decides what this new currency is going to be, what the implications are for a new global reserve currency, and can we rely on an economy like Russia, for instance? Because Russia, with all of these sanctions against it, yes, of course, they are holding up very well, but when we look into the future, are they still going to hold up very well? Let's perhaps look at that. Prof, do you want to talk politics, currencies, and who determines what that next reserve currency is?
In simple terms, Leanne, who determines what then becomes the global reserve currency is the strongest among us. So again, we are back to the issue of war and the military. And if we may link it to Africa, there are very strong arguments that the main reason why the Colonel brother leader Muammar Gaddafi was assassinated was because he was championing the use of the gold standard or the gold coin as a central currency for African countries. But that is a debate for another day. You asked a very important question, who determines and how do they determine it? I think there is something that is called leadership. When leaders decide to abandon one paradigm and shift to another, it then causes seismic shifts. For now, we see that China, India, Iran, and Turkey, among themselves, they are already trading in their currencies. What does this mean? That they are sidelining the United States dollar, just these 4 countries. It means that at present, the global market is excluding 3 billion people from the US dollar-dominated international system. Over 3 billion people no longer need to use the United States dollar to trade with one another. This is just a fraction of the global south. I am just talking about 4 economies here. So as more countries continue to move away from the petrodollar system, from the US euro dominancy, which uses the US dollar as the payment for oil, we expect massive inflationary pressures to strike the United States economy. But the most important thing, Leanne, is that the United States is not going to take this lying down. Of course, the United Kingdom did it when the pound sterling was usurped by the United States dollar. But I don't think that the United States will simply sit and watch and see the United States dollar being rendered a worthless currency like the Zimbabwean dollar. So we are most likely going to see a fight back. Now, going back to the theme of war, Ukraine is receiving aid from all over the West. Right now, at the last check, I think they received 60 billion. How are they going to pay back that money? This is where the issue of resources comes in. Remember how the United States became rich after the war. It is because all the European countries now had to pay back the money that the United States had used to finance the war. And this is how the United States became a very strong economy. There are innuendos that the maneuvers that are happening in Taiwan are to provoke China into a type of Russian reaction so that the United States can gauge how far China is willing to go. Remember, we have never seen an angry China. China is always calm and collected, and it has not flexed its muscle, so to speak. So we are in really for a long ride, to put it that way.
We really are, and it is just getting more and more interesting, but more and more scary at the same time. Reg, I'm going to leave the final note with you because we are going into news now. What does it mean for South Africa? Because that, the long and short of it, that's what we really want to know here. I mean, we've already seen the repercussions of what happens in a war like Russia and Ukraine and what it does for us. And also, you know, we look at our membership in BRICS, so we're very close to Russia, we're close to China, but we also have good standing with the US. And at the same time, we're hearing former President Trump warning of a depression in the US economy. And we know that if the US catches a cold, the the whole world sneezes. And, you know, I mean, we look at something like the 1929 Great Depression and the recent recession in 2008. Should we be worried? Should we as South Africa and the rest of the economies of the world be worried?
Absolutely not. In fact, it's quite an advantage for South Africa to be aligned to the BRICS, given the dynamics that we see. For South Africa as a country, you must remember that the framework that we use, the macroeconomic framework that we use, which is quite atrocious, is neoliberal and primitive, is a consequence of the US exercising quite largely its coercive economic statecraft. And hence, we're getting poorer and poorer as a consequence of the regime that we put in place, which itself is because of the influence and the fear South Africa has in abandoning it, because it says, well, look, we're dependent on the US on this and that. And after all, the US can actually unplug South Africa from the system. What happens? The entire economy collapses. So South Africa was afraid. And I think this is an interesting development that we should all be very happy that we can now begin to be autonomous as we should. So there are lots of advantages for South Africa to be part of this development, and it should all go well in the future for the rest of us.
We'll leave it there. Gentlemen, what a fascinating discussion. Executive Director, Head of Research on Macroeconomics, Money and Banking at Firstsource Money, Redge Nkosi, and Associate Professor of African Politics in the Department of Unisa, Professor Everisto Benyera, discussing the implications of Russia and China to create their own international reserve currency.